I arrived at the trailhead an hour early to check my gear one last time, though I'd already done it twice back at the lodge. Force of habit after 15 years as a guide. The morning air felt crisp against my face, the kind of mountain chill that burned your lungs a little if you breathed too deep. I leaned against my truck and watched the road, waiting for the clients to show up in whatever luxury rentals they'd chosen for the drive from Jackson. Right on time, a small convoy appeared. 2 black SUVs that probably cost more than I made in a year. They pulled into the gravel lot, kicking up dust that caught the morning light. I straightened up and put on my professional smile as 5 men climbed out, looking exactly like the photos they'd sent for my pre-trip planning. Joel Moore stepped out first, fussing with a backpack that still had tags hanging from the straps. He was a tech executive according to the booking forms, and everything about him screamed office job, from his soft hands to the way he squinted at the sun like it was an unexpected inconvenience. "You must be Logan," he said, extending his hand. "The rental place didn't have GPS that covered this area. Had to use actual road signs like it's the 90s. I shook his hand. "Welcome to Wyoming, Mr. Moore. Sometimes the old ways work best out here." Bodie Gardner was next, a hedge fund manager wearing hiking boots so new they squeaked when he walked. He moved with the careful precision of someone who'd researched wilderness trips extensively online but had never actually been on one. "The drive was quite scenic," he said, his voice carrying the polished tone of someone used to boardrooms. "Though I'm surprised at the lack of cell service for the last 20 miles. "That's part of the appeal," I said. "You're officially off the grid now." Brett Anderson practically bounded from the SUV, a camera already in hand. The real estate mogul had more gadgets strapped to his body than I'd seen on most professional photographers. Action cameras, a drone case, and what looked like at least 3 different phones in various pockets. "This lighting is perfect," he announced, snapping photos of the mountains without so much as a hello. "Logan, you picked an amazing spot. How many Instagram followers do you have? You should be documenting these trips." "Don't really do social media," I replied, watching him adjust settings on a camera that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Harold Chavez emerged slowly, his attention fixed on the satellite phone in his hand. The pharmaceutical CEO frowned at the device as if it had personally insulted him. "Signal's weak," he muttered. "Is that normal? My office needs to be able to reach me." "It'll come and go," I explained. That's why I gave everyone the emergency contact protocol before the trip. Easton Peterson was the last to join us, already wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. The oil executive looked uncomfortable in his expensive outdoor clothing, the fabric still stiff with newness. "Damn mountain air is thinner than I remembered," he wheezed, though we were barely at elevation yet. "How far are we hiking today?" I gathered them around the hood of my truck where I'd spread out a topographic map. 5 faces looked at me with varying degrees of interest and apprehension. "Welcome to the Wyoming backcountry, gentlemen," I began, tapping the map. "We'll be covering about 6 miles today to our first campsite. The terrain starts easy, but gets more challenging after lunch. We should reach camp with plenty of daylight left to set up." I ran through my standard safety briefing, explaining what to do if they got separated from the group, how to use the whistles I'd be providing, and the importance of staying hydrated at elevation. "Before we head out, let's do a quick gear check," I said, moving to their packs. It was worse than I'd expected. Joel had packed 3 pairs of shoes, but no rain gear. Bodie had brought a first aid kit filled with hospital-grade supplies, but forgotten basic items like a headlamp. Brett's pack was overloaded with camera equipment, but light on essentials. Harold had packed enough medications to stock a small pharmacy, but no proper layers for cold nights. Easton had somehow managed to bring the wrong kind of sleeping bag, one rated for summer use despite our clear pre-trip instructions about nighttime temperatures. I kept my face neutral as I pulled emergency supplies from my own pack and distributed them. Extra rain ponchos, proper headlamps, emergency blankets, and water purification tablets. These should fill the gaps in your kits, I said diplomatically. No charge. You came prepared, Bodhi noted, examining the high-quality headlamp I'd handed him. That's my job. I helped them adjust their packs, showing them how to distribute weight properly. Everyone fill your water bottles. Once they're full, we'll head out. As they fumbled with their water reservoirs, I stepped away to check the sky. Dark clouds were building over the western ridge, not immediately threatening, but concerning. The forecast had mentioned possible afternoon showers, but those clouds suggested something more substantial might be brewing. I decided not to mention it yet. No sense alarming them when we had plenty of time to reach shelter. All set? I called, shouldering my own pack. Let's move out. Stay together, pace yourselves, and speak up if you need a break. I deliberately set an easy pace as we left the trailhead. Within the first half mile, I could tell these men rarely exercised outside climate-controlled gyms. Joel was already adjusting his shoulder straps every few minutes. Bodhi's careful steps showed he was worried about twisting an ankle. Brett kept stopping to photograph everything from ordinary pine cones to basic trail markers. Harold checked his satellite phone at every slight elevation change, and Easton's breathing was already labored. The trail opens up around this bend, I said, pointing ahead. We'll see the valley floor and the ridge will follow tomorrow. How much farther to the first rest stop? Joel asked, his voice strained despite our slow pace. We've gone about 3/4 of a mile, I replied. First scheduled break is at mile 2, but we can stop sooner if needed. I'm fine, Joel insisted, though his reddening face suggested otherwise. I'd guided worse groups before. Bachelor parties who showed up hungover, corporate retreats where half the participants were actively trying to undermine each other, families with teenagers who refused to look up from their phones. These 5 were at least enthusiastic about the trip, even if they were woefully unprepared for it. As we continued, the forest thickened around us. Lodgepole pines gave way to denser spruce and fir, their branches creating a canopy that dappled the sunlight on the forest floor. I pointed out fresh deer tracks, a hawk circling overhead, and the distant outline of the mountain range we'd be approaching over the next few days. By midday, we'd covered just under 4 miles. I called a lunch break beside a small stream, helping everyone find comfortable spots to sit and remove their packs. As they pulled out elaborate packed lunches, prepared by the luxury lodge where they'd stayed last night, I walked a short distance away to check the sky again. The clouds had continued to build, darker now and moving our way. The wind had picked up too, bending the tops of the taller trees. My weather sense, honed by years in these mountains, told me we'd likely see rain before nightfall. I glanced back at the group, now engaged in a spirited debate about cryptocurrency investments, and decided we needed to pick up the pace after lunch. We'll head out in 15 minutes, I announced, returning to the group. The next section has less cover, so we'll want to move efficiently. Why the rush? Easton asked between bites of what looked like a gourmet sandwich. The brochure said this was a leisurely pace trip. Just being cautious with daylight, I said, not mentioning the approaching weather front. Better to have extra time at camp than to feel rushed setting up. We resumed hiking with slightly more urgency in our steps. I kept them moving with gentle but persistent encouragement, pointing out interesting features of the landscape to distract from their growing fatigue. The trail gradually climbed in elevation, and I could hear the labored breathing behind me as we tackled a series of switchbacks. By mid-afternoon, the wind had grown stronger, and I could smell rain in the air. We were still about a mile from my planned campsite, but I spotted a suitable alternative just ahead. A relatively flat area with good tree cover and a natural windbreak formed by a rock outcropping. We'll make camp here, I announced, stopping in the clearing. All ready? Brett asked, checking his fitness tracker. We've only gone 5.25 miles. Your itinerary said 6. This is a better spot, I explained, gesturing to the natural protection around us. Good water source, flat ground for tents, and natural shelter. As if on cue, a distant rumble of thunder emphasized my point. The clients exchanged nervous glances. "All right, let's get these tents up," I said, dropping my pack and pulling out a ground tarp. "I'll demonstrate with mine first, then help each of you with yours." I quickly set up my two-person tent, narrating each step clearly. The men watched with varying levels of comprehension as I secured the rainfly and staked out the guidelines. "Now it's your turn," I said, moving to help Joel first. The next hour was an exercise in patience. Joel kept trying to attach poles to the wrong sections. Bodhi approached his tent assembly like a surgical procedure, overthinking each step until I gently urged him forward. Brett kept stopping to document the process on camera. Harold insisted on taking business calls despite the spotty connection, attempting to stake his tent one-handed. Easton grew frustrated quickly, eventually letting me do most of the work while he supervised. By the time all 6 tents were erected, the first fat raindrops were beginning to fall. I showed them how to secure their gear inside, keeping food items separate in the bear-proof containers I distributed earlier. "We'll cook under that rock overhang," I said, pointing to a natural shelter at the edge of our camp. "The storm should pass by morning." As darkness began to fall, the rain intensified. I got a small cooking fire going in the protected area and prepared a simple but hearty stew, much to the surprise of my clients who had expected to eat freeze-dried meals. "This is actually good," Harold admitted between spoonfuls. 15 years of practice," I replied, stirring the pot. "You learn what works out here." After dinner, with the clients huddled in the dry space beneath the rock overhang, I gave them a briefing on tomorrow's route and what wildlife we might encounter. The rain drummed steadily on the forest canopy above us, occasionally dripping through in heavy splats. "Any questions before we turn in?" I asked, packing away the cleaned cooking gear. "Are we safe here?" Joel asked, eyeing the darkness beyond our small circle of light. "From, bears and such?" "We've taken all the proper precautions," I assured him. "Food is stored away from the tents, and I'm a light sleeper. Just remember what I said about keeping snacks out of your tents." As they retired to their shelters, I made one final check of our perimeter, making sure all food containers were properly secured and checking that everyone's rainfly was correctly tensioned against the wind. The storm was settling in for the night, but our position was good. Drainage channels would carry water away from the tents, and the tree cover broke the force of the wind. I paused at the edge of camp, listening to the sounds of the forest through the rainfall, the creaking of branches, the pattering of drops on leaves, the occasional call of a night bird. This was where I felt most at home, even with the responsibility of 5 inexperienced clients weighing on my shoulders. With everything secured, I crawled into my own tent, laying out my sleeping bag on the insulated pad. Through the tent fabric, I could hear Joel fumbling with his headlamp, Brett's camera beeping as he reviewed the day's photos, and Bodhi asking Harold something about the correct way to use a sleeping bag liner. I zipped my bag around me and listened to the rain, mentally reviewing tomorrow's route and considering alternatives if the weather didn't improve. Years of experience had taught me to always have contingency plans ready, especially with a group this green. As I drifted towards sleep, I had no idea what the coming days would bring to our wilderness expedition, but I was confident in my ability to handle whatever challenges arose. After all, that's what they were paying me for. The first day of the trek had gone about as well as I'd expected, which is to say not great. The second day followed the same pattern. Joel had been limping since midday, his expensive hiking boots proving to be a poor match for his unprepared feet. "Logan, do you have any more of those bandages?" Joel asked as he lowered himself onto a flat rock near our lunch spot, wincing as he pulled off his right boot. I dug through my pack and handed him the first aid kit. "Use the moleskin patches. They'll stick better than regular bandages." He fumbled with the packaging, clearly unfamiliar with basic first aid supplies. I knelt down to help, noting at least 3 angry blisters forming on his heel and along the side of his foot. "This is why we break in new boots before a trip like this," I said, keeping my tone neutral as I applied the patches. Joel nodded sheepishly. The salesperson said they'd be comfortable right away. I bit back a comment about trusting outdoor equipment salespeople who worked on commission. Instead, I finished patching him up and moved on to check on the others. Bodie was 20 yards away, struggling with his water filter at the edge of a small stream. Despite having what looked like an engineering degree's worth of concentration on his face, he'd assembled it backward. "Need a hand?" I asked, approaching slowly to avoid startling him. "I followed the instructions exactly," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "The diagram shows this piece connecting to this valve, but it's not working." I gently took the filter from him. "You've got the intake and output reversed. Easy mistake." I reassembled it correctly and demonstrated how to use it properly. "Try it now." Bodie's face flushed slightly as he successfully filled his water bottle. "Thanks. I should have figured that out." Brett wandered over, camera in hand as usual. "Hey Logan, can you get a shot of me filtering water? My followers would love to see authentic wilderness survival techniques." I stepped aside as Brett handed his phone to Bodie and posed dramatically by the stream, dipping his filter into the water with exaggerated care. I'd already explained at least 3 times that there was no cell service here, but he insisted on documenting everything for an eventual social media dump when we returned to civilization. Harold sat apart from the group, picking at his trail lunch with obvious distaste. "Logan," he called out, "these dehydrated meals are barely edible. Couldn't we have packed something with actual nutritional value?" "Those meals have all the calories and nutrients you need for this kind of activity," I replied evenly. "And they're lightweight, which matters when you're carrying everything on your back." Harold muttered something about paying enough to expect better accommodations, a comment I'd heard variations of at least a dozen times since we'd set out. Easton approached me with the map in hand, his face set in that now familiar expression of someone who thinks they know better. "Logan, I've been looking at the route. If we cut through this valley instead of following the ridge, we could save at least 2 miles tomorrow." I glanced at where his finger jabbed at the map. "That valley floods this time of year. The trail might look shorter, but we'd end up wading through mud or worse. The ridge route is safer and actually faster." Easton didn't look convinced, but he folded the map with a shrug. "If you say so." I'd guided enough groups like this to know the pattern. City executives used to being in charge, making decisions, having their opinions valued above others. Out here, their expertise meant nothing, but accepting that reality wasn't easy for men who defined themselves by their authority. By the time we made camp that evening, I was mentally exhausted from the constant management of egos and expectations. Still, I kept my expression neutral as I helped each client with their tent setup. Bodie overthought every step, consulting the instructions repeatedly. Brett took photos of his half-assembled tent rather than focusing on completing it properly. Harold tried to take business calls on his satellite phone despite the spotty connection, leaving his gear scattered around his site. Easton insisted he knew what he was doing until his tent collapsed for the 3rd time, at which point he reluctantly accepted my help. I prepared dinner as darkness fell, a simple but hearty stew that even Harold admitted was surprisingly decent. After our meal, I went through the usual evening routine, securing food away from the campsite, checking that everyone had what they needed for the night, and answering questions about tomorrow's route. By the time I crawled into my own tent, physical fatigue had joined the mental exhaustion. Sleep came quickly that night, as it usually did after a long day on the trail. But it didn't last. I woke suddenly in the darkness, my body tense before my mind fully registered why. Music was floating through the trees, if you could call it music. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard in 20 years of wilderness guiding. The melody, if that was the right word, seemed to shift in ways that felt wrong somehow, notes bending in patterns that made my skin crawl. It sounded ancient and completely alien at the same time, as if it predated human music entirely. I sat up in my sleeping bag, suddenly wide awake. Every hair on my arm stood on end as the eerie sound echoed throughout the forest. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, impossible to pinpoint. I grabbed my headlamp and unzipped my tent as quietly as possible, stepping out into the cool night air. The music continued, notes rising and falling in sequences that felt mathematically wrong, as if they followed rules of harmony from some other world. No human instrument could produce those sounds. I was certain of that. I'd heard plenty of strange noises in the wilderness over the years. The wail of a mountain lion that sounds like a woman screaming, the low vibration of wind through rock formations, even the bizarre chorus of certain insects that can sound almost synthetic. But this was different. This was wrong. I turned slowly, trying to determine the direction of the sound. The camp remained still, my clients apparently sleeping through the otherworldly concert. The music seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest, beyond the clearing where we'd set up camp. I took a few steps toward the tree line, debating whether to investigate further. 20 years of wilderness experience told me to stay put, to not wander into unfamiliar forest at night. But 20 years of experience also told me this sound wasn't natural, wasn't something I could explain away with rational knowledge of the environment. Before I could make a decision, the music began to fade. Not like a human musician finishing a piece, but like something being gradually pulled away, the notes stretching and thinning until they disappeared completely. Within moments, the forest returned to its normal nighttime silence, the soft rustle of leaves, the occasional call of a night bird, the distant sound of the stream we'd camped near. I stood motionless for several minutes, straining to hear if the music would return. It didn't. Eventually, the cold drove me back into my tent, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake for what felt like hours, replaying the strange melody in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. Morning came with welcome normality, birds singing, sunlight filtering through the trees, the sounds of my clients stirring in their tents. I was already boiling water for coffee when Joel emerged from his tent, looking rumpled and tired. "Did you hear that weird noise last night?" he asked, accepting the cup of coffee I offered him. My stomach tightened, so I hadn't imagined it. "What did it sound like to you?" I asked carefully. Joel frowned, blowing on his coffee. I don't know. Kind of like music, but not really. It woke me up for a bit. Figured it was just the wind or something." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Yeah, that happens sometimes in this area. The wind passes through those rock formations about half a mile east of us, creates some strange sounds." "Huh," Joel said, seeming satisfied with this explanation. "Sounded almost like singing. Weird." "Nature can play tricks on your ears," I said, turning to check on the oatmeal I was preparing for breakfast, especially at night. I didn't believe my own explanation. Not for a second. Wind through rocks could create whistling, humming, even some harmonics that might sound musical. But what I'd heard last night was complex, structured, intentional. It wasn't random noise shaped by natural features. It was something else entirely. But what would I tell them instead? That I'd heard supernatural music with no identifiable source? That something inexplicable was out there in the forest? These men were already struggling with the basic challenges of wilderness travel. Adding fears about mysterious phenomena would only make the situation worse. As the others emerged from their tents and gathered for breakfast, I kept the conversation focused on practical matters: today's route, weather expectations, what wildlife we might encounter. No one else mentioned hearing strange music in the night, and I didn't bring it up. But as we packed up camp and prepared to move out, I found myself scanning the forest more carefully than usual, looking for what? I didn't know. Some sign, some explanation for what I'd heard. There was nothing visible, nothing that stood out as unusual or concerning. Just trees, rocks, the normal features of the Wyoming wilderness I knew so well. We shouldered our packs and hit the trail, my clients falling into their now familiar patterns, Joel adjusting his pack straps every few minutes, Bodie carefully watching his footing, Brett stopping for photos, Harold checking his satellite phone, Easton breathing heavily but refusing to admit he needed a break. I led them onward, maintaining my outward calm while my mind kept returning to those impossible notes that had filled the night air. In 20 years of guiding, I'd never experienced anything like it. And despite my reassurances to Joel, I had no rational explanation for what we'd heard. I stopped in my tracks when I spotted Brett crouching at the edge of the clearing. The rest of the group had spread out, taking advantage of the open space after hours of hiking through dense forest. Brett was hunched over something, his posture tense with excitement. "Logan, check this out." Brett waved me over, his voice carrying across the clearing. I made my way toward him, stepping carefully through the tall grass. The midday sun beat down on my neck as I approached. "Look at this," Brett said, holding up what looked like a perfectly round stone about the size of a baseball. I crouched beside him, and he placed it in my outstretched hand. The moment the stone touched my skin, I felt wrong. The object was unnaturally smooth, like nothing I'd seen in 20 years of wilderness guiding. Its surface had no imperfections, no chips, no scratches, nothing to suggest it had existed in nature. "Feel how perfectly round it is," Brett said, his eyes wide with excitement. But what bothered me more was the subtle vibration. At first I thought it might be my pulse, but no. The stone itself seemed to hum with energy, sending uncomfortable tingles through my palms. "Where did you find this exactly?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral while fighting the urge to drop the thing. Brett pointed to a small depression in the ground a few feet away. It was just sitting there like someone placed it. Weird, right? I handed the stone back to him, wiping my palm against my pants. The tingling sensation lingered. "I think you should put it back where you found it," I said. Brett laughed. "Are you serious? This thing is amazing. We're in protected wilderness. Taking items out could get you in legal trouble." This was true, but it wasn't my main concern. Something about that stone felt deeply wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. My gut instinct, the same one that had saved me countless times in the backcountry, was screaming at me to leave it alone. "Come on, who's gonna know? It's just a cool rock," Brett said, turning the stone over in his hands. The other clients had started to gather around us, drawn by Brett's excitement. "What did you find?" Joel asked, adjusting his designer sunglasses. "Some kind of stone artifact," Brett replied before I could speak. "Perfectly round. Could be worth something." "I strongly recommend leaving it here," I said more firmly this time. "Besides the legal issues, we don't know what it is or where it came from." Harold snorted. "It's a rock, Logan. Not exactly mysterious." But it was. The unnatural smoothness, the vibration. This wasn't just some river stone polished by water over time. This was something else. "Brett, seriously," I tried again. "My job is to keep you all safe out here, and part of that means respecting the wilderness. That stone belongs here, not in someone's living room." Brett looked at me for a long moment, then shrugged and smiled. "I hear you, but I'm keeping it. It'll make a great souvenir." Before I could object further, he stuffed the stone into the top pocket of his backpack. "We should keep moving if we want to reach camp before dark," I said, knowing I'd lost this battle. As we continued our hike, I kept glancing at Brett's pack, unable to shake my unease. The other clients chatted about stock portfolios and vacation homes, but my mind stayed fixed on that stone. In all my years guiding, I'd never felt such an immediate aversion to an object. We reached our campsite with about an hour of daylight left. The spot was ideal, a small plateau sheltered by a stand of pines with a clear stream nearby. I supervised tent setup with half my attention, watching Brett more carefully than usual. He seemed normal enough, joking with the others and complaining about the lack of cell service like always. After dinner, as darkness settled over the camp, everyone retreated to their tents. I performed my usual perimeter check, secured the food, and finally crawled into my own sleeping bag. The fatigue of the day's hike should have pulled me straight into sleep, but I lay awake, listening. The music started subtly, so faint I thought I might be imagining it, but it grew stronger, more defined than the night before. The same impossible notes that bent in ways music shouldn't. The same ancient feeling that made the hair on my arms stand up. But this time it seemed to come from the earth itself, vibrating up through the ground beneath my sleeping pad. I lay perfectly still, listening to the unearthly melody. It wasn't just louder than before. It felt closer, more insistent, like it was trying to communicate something. The notes twisted and turned in patterns that made no mathematical sense, creating harmonies that shouldn't exist. From the tent next to mine, I heard movement. Brett's tent. The rustle of a sleeping bag, followed by muttering. At first, I thought he was talking to one of the other clients, but the cadence was wrong. More like someone talking in their sleep. I strained to make out words, but couldn't distinguish anything coherent. Just mumbling, punctuated by occasional sharp intakes of breath. The music seemed to intensify with each of Brett's mutterings, as if responding to him. The connection hit me with sudden clarity. The stone. The damn stone Brett had insisted on keeping was somehow linked to this music. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. We find the stone. And that same night the music grows stronger. The vibration I'd felt in my palm, the unnatural perfection of the object, and now these sounds that couldn't possibly be natural. I wanted to get up, to check on Brett, maybe to take the stone, and wanted to get up, to check on Brett, maybe to take the stone and hurl it into the darkness, but something kept me frozen in my sleeping bag. Not fear exactly, but a deep, instinctual caution. The music continued, weaving patterns through the night air that my brain couldn't properly process. Brett's mumbling grew louder. I caught fragments now, not words exactly, but sounds that mimicked the impossible melodies surrounding us. His voice rose and fell in rhythm with the music, as if he were trying to sing along in his sleep. I pressed my hands against my ears, but it did nothing to block the sound. The music wasn't just coming through the air. It seemed to bypass my ears entirely, resonating directly inside my skull. 20 years in the wilderness, and I'd never experienced anything like this. I'd heard strange sounds before. Wind through rock formations, distant animal calls distorted by canyons, even the low-frequency rumble of far-off avalanches. But this was different. This was structured, intentional. The logical part of my mind searched for explanations, some kind of hallucination brought on by altitude sickness. But we weren't high enough for that, and besides, I'd never experienced any symptoms before. Carbon monoxide from a faulty camp stove? No, we were in open air and the symptoms didn't match. Group hysteria? Possibly, except the others didn't seem affected beyond Brett's sleep-talking. The stone. It had to be the stone. Brett's mutterings suddenly stopped, and the music seemed to pause with him. The silence lasted only seconds before both resumed, now perfectly synchronized. Whatever connection existed between Brett and that stone was growing stronger. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the interplay between the unearthly music and Brett's unconscious responses. Eventually, the sounds began to fade, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely, leaving only the normal sounds of the forest at night. The rustle of wind through pine needles, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant gurgle of the stream. Brett fell silent too. I waited another 30 minutes, making sure the phenomenon had truly passed, then finally allowed myself to relax enough to drift toward sleep. My last conscious thought was a decision. Tomorrow I would convince Brett to leave that stone behind. whatever it took. Morning arrived with painful brightness. I crawled from my tent stiff and unrested to find the others already stirring. Joel stood by the cold fire pit, attempting to start the camp stove for coffee. Bodie was organizing his excessive first aid supplies for the third time this trip. Harold and Easton sat on logs, comparing notes on their satellite phones. Brett emerged last, looking surprisingly well-rested. The dark circles that had been under his eyes yesterday were gone, and his movements seemed more energetic than they had been since we started the trip. "Morning, Logan," he said cheerfully. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" I studied his face, looking for any sign that he remembered his restless night or the strange mutterings. There was nothing. Just the same self-satisfied expression he usually wore. "Sleep well?" I asked casually, handing him a mug of instant coffee. "Like a rock," he said, then laughed at his own joke. Speaking of which, he reached into his pack and pulled out the stone. In the morning light, it looked even more unnatural, perfectly spherical, with a surface so smooth it almost seemed polished. The color was difficult to pin down, somewhere between deep gray and black, but with subtle shifts when the light hit it from different angles. "Still think I should have left this behind?" Brett asked, holding it up. "It's even cooler in daylight." The others gathered around, examining the stone with curious expressions. I watched their faces carefully, looking for any sign that they'd heard the music last night, but saw only normal interest. "It is unusual," I admitted, "but my recommendation stands. We should leave it here." "Why are you so worked up about a rock?" Easton asked, frowning at me. I chose my next words carefully. These were wealthy, successful men used to getting their way. Telling them I thought the stone was somehow creating impossible music that only Brett and I could hear would destroy my credibility instantly. "I've seen what happens when people remove items from protected wilderness," I said instead. "Fines can reach thousands of dollars, and that's if they catch you with a normal rock or plant. Something unusual like this could potentially be archaeologically significant, which means bigger penalties." Brett rolled the stone between his palms, seemingly unconcerned. "I'll take my chances. Did you notice anything strange last night?" I tried a different approach. "Any unusual sounds?" Brett looked at me blankly. "Like what?" "I don't know. Music, maybe?" The others exchanged glances. "Music?" Joel laughed. "Out here?" "I slept like the dead," Harold said. "Didn't hear a thing." Brett shrugged. "Same here. Why? Did you hear something?" So he didn't remember his sleep talking or the music that had accompanied it. That was concerning in its own way. "Just some strange sounds," I said vaguely. "Probably just the wind." Brett tucked the stone back into his pack, and I felt a surge of frustration. I could force the issue. As guide, I had some authority. But without concrete evidence of danger, demanding he abandon his souvenir would seem arbitrary and controlling. These men were paying clients, and this was ultimately a service industry. As we broke camp and prepared for the day's hike, I kept a close eye on Brett. He seemed normal enough, if unusually energetic. Throughout the morning, I caught him reaching into his pack several times to touch the stone, almost absently, like someone checking for their wallet or keys. I hoped that whatever had happened last night was a one-time occurrence, but deep down, I knew better. The music would return tonight, probably stronger than before, and somehow I needed to convince Brett to get rid of that stone before we discovered what it really was. I kept an eye on Brett over the next few days. His behavior changed in small ways at first, the kind of shifts most people might miss. But after 20 years of watching clients in the wilderness, I'd learned to spot the warning signs. During our morning hike, Brett lagged behind the group, one hand always inside his pack's top pocket, where he'd stashed the stone. Every 15 minutes or so, he'd stop completely, pull it out, and just stare at it before tucking it away again. "Everything okay back there?" I called back to him after the third time. "Yeah, just checking something," he answered, quickening his pace to catch up. By lunch, the pattern had become obvious. While the others unpacked their meals on a flat outcropping with a decent view, Brett sat apart, the stone resting in his palm. He stroked its surface with his thumb in slow, circular motions. "That's a nice rock you found," Joel said, trying to make conversation. Brett clutched it closer to his chest. "It's warm," he said, not looking up. "Can you believe that? It stays warm all the time." "Probably just holding your body heat," Harold offered between bites of his energy bar. "No," Brett insisted. "It generates its own heat. Here, feel it." He held it out reluctantly toward Harold, who reached over and touched it briefly. "Seems like a normal rock to me," Harold said with a shrug. I watched Brett's face fall, then harden with resolve. "You just don't understand it," he muttered, turning away and continuing to stroke the stone. That afternoon, our path took us along a ridge with views of the valley below. The weather held steady. Clear skies, mild temperature, light breeze, ideal hiking conditions. But Brett seemed oblivious to the landscape, his attention fixed inward. During our brief rest stops, while the others took photos or checked their satellite phones, Brett wandered a few yards away, holding the stone at eye level and talking to it in hushed tones. The first time I caught him doing this, I approached casually. "Finding anything interesting about that stone?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Brett startled, nearly fumbling the stone before securing it tightly. "It has patterns," he said. "If you look closely enough, you can see them shifting." I glanced at the stone. In the daylight, it remained unnaturally perfect, a sphere so smooth it seemed polished by machinery rather than nature. Its color shifted subtly between deep gray and black, depending on how the light hit it. But I saw no patterns. "Maybe you should drink some water," I suggested, offering my spare bottle. "Dehydration can make you see things that aren't there, especially at this altitude." Brett's face darkened. "I'm not dehydrated," he snapped, pocketing the stone. "And I'm not seeing things." I backed off, but kept watching. By evening, when we made camp in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees, Brett had taken to whispering to the stone whenever he thought no one was looking. During dinner, he barely touched his food, instead keeping one hand in his pocket where I knew he was holding the stone. The other clients noticed too. I caught Easton and Bodie exchanging concerned glances when Brett responded to Joel's question about his real estate business with a non-sequitur about ancient forests. "The trees remember everything," Brett said, his gaze unfocused. "They've been here for centuries, listening." "Sure, some of these trees are pretty old," I agreed, trying to normalize his statement. "The ecosystem here has remained relatively unchanged for thousands of years." Brett looked at me with sudden intensity. "Exactly. They've seen them come and go." "Seen who come and go?" Bodie asked. Brett just smiled and went back to fingering the stone in his pocket. After dinner, I pulled Brett aside while the others prepared their tents for the night. "Look, Brett, I think you might be experiencing some altitude sickness," I said gently. "It can affect people in strange ways. Disorientation, fixation, even mild hallucinations. Nothing to be embarrassed about. But we should monitor it." His reaction was immediate and defensive. "There's nothing wrong with me," he hissed, backing away. "You're just trying to take it from me." "Take what?" "The stone. You want it for yourself because you know it's special." I raised my hands in a placating gesture. "I don't want your stone, Brett. I'm concerned about your health, that's all." "I'm fine," he insisted, his voice rising enough that Joel glanced over from his tent. "Better than fine. I'm understanding things I never did before." I decided to back off again. Pushing him would only make him more paranoid, and we still had several days left in the wilderness. I'd need to watch him carefully and reassess in the morning. That night, I lay awake in my tent, listening to the normal sounds of the forest, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the occasional distant call of an owl. No music yet, but I remained tense, expecting it at any moment. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the distinctive sound of a tent zipper. Quiet footsteps followed, moving away from our campsite. I waited a minute, then silently unzipped my own tent and stepped out into the cool night air. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see Brett's figure about 30 yards from camp. He sat cross-legged on a flat rock, his back to me, head bowed over something in his hands. The stone. I approached slowly, making just enough noise that I wouldn't startle him. When I was about 10 feet away, I heard his voice, soft but distinct in the night air. "Yes, I understand," he was saying. "They were here first, long before us." I cleared my throat. "Brett?" He turned, and in the moonlight, his face looked different, relaxed yet somehow vacant. His eyes reflected the moonlight strangely, pupils expanded despite the brightness. "Logan," he said, his voice oddly formal, "come listen, it's singing to me." I moved closer, fighting the instinct to retreat. "What's singing?" "The stone," he said, holding it up. "It sings when everyone else is asleep. It tells me things." I crouched down beside him, noticing how the stone seemed to vibrate slightly in his palm. The vibrations were stronger than before. Not just a subtle tingling, but an actual tremor I could see with my naked eye. "What kind of things does it tell you?" I asked carefully. Brett's face lit up with childlike wonder. "About the old ones who lived here, before humans. They understood the music of the earth in ways we've forgotten." He leaned closer, whispering conspiratorially. "They're still here, you know, waiting beneath the mountains." A chill ran up my back that had nothing to do with the night air. "Brett, I think you might be experiencing some hallucinations. It happens sometimes in the wilderness, especially when sleep patterns are disrupted." He laughed, a hollow sound that didn't match his usual boisterous chuckle. "That's what they said people would think. That's why they only speak to one person at a time." He held the stone closer to his chest. "They chose me, Logan, to hear their message." I tried a different approach. "What if we put the stone away until morning? Get some rest and look at it with fresh eyes?" Brett's demeanor changed instantly. His face hardened and he clutched the stone tighter. "You don't believe me. You think I'm crazy." "I don't think you're crazy," I said truthfully. "I think something strange is happening and we need to be careful." "The stone is mine," he said firmly. "I found it, and it chose me." I recognized the signs of a psychological breakdown developing. The paranoia, the grandiose thinking, the attachment to an inanimate object imbued with special powers. In the city, I might have called for professional help, but out here, days from civilization, my options were limited. "Let's at least go back to camp," I suggested. "It's cold out here." After some gentle coaxing, Brett agreed to return to his tent, the stone still clutched in his hand. I watched him zip himself inside, then returned to my own tent, my mind racing with concern. I lay awake for hours, listening for any sound of Brett moving again. I knew I was facing an impossible situation. If Brett's condition worsened, I'd have to evacuate the entire group, a decision that would cost thousands of dollars and earn me the resentment of the other clients. But if I did nothing and something happened to Brett, the responsibility would fall squarely on my shoulders. Eventually, I drifted into an uneasy sleep, the image of Brett's dilated pupils and the vibrating stone following me into troubled dreams. I woke at dawn, feeling like I hadn't slept at all, with the weight of impossible choices pressing down on me. I had to keep everyone safe, but I had no idea how to protect Brett from whatever was happening to him, or from himself. I woke up to a symphony that felt like it was playing inside my skull. The music had returned, but this time it was so loud, so impossibly present, that I couldn't even pretend to ignore it. The notes bent and twisted in ways that defied musical theory, creating harmonies that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, yet somehow did. I sat bolt upright in my sleeping bag, my breath forming clouds in the cold night air of my tent. This wasn't just louder than before. It was different. The music had a desperate, urgent quality, like it was calling to someone, or commanding them. Brett. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, yanking on my boots without bothering to lace them. The temperature had dropped dramatically overnight, and a thin layer of snow covered the ground outside my tent. I unzipped the tent flap with fingers already stiffening from cold and stepped out into the night. The camp was still. 4 tents stood in their original positions, dark and silent. But when my eyes found Brett's tent, I saw the entrance flap hanging open, swaying slightly in the gentle breeze. I crossed to his tent in 3 long strides and stuck my head inside. The beam of my flashlight revealed an empty sleeping bag, still holding the vague impression of Brett's body. My stomach dropped. I was responsible for these men. For Brett. And now he was out there somewhere, following that impossible music. Damn it, I muttered, pulling my head back out of the tent. I scanned the perimeter of our campsite. Fresh footprints led away from Brett's tent into the trees, a single set pressed into the light dusting of snow. Without hesitation, I followed them, clicking on my flashlight to better track the trail. The footprints moved with purpose, not the wandering path of someone sleepwalking, but the direct route of a person answering a call. They led straight into the densest part of the forest, where the pines grew so close together they blocked most of the moonlight. I moved as quickly as I could without losing the trail, my breath puffing white in front of me. The music grew louder with each step, confirming I was heading toward its source. After about 10 minutes of walking, I noticed the footprints becoming less even, more erratic, as if Brett had started to stumble or lose coordination. The trees thinned ahead, revealing a small clearing bathed in moonlight, and there, standing in its center, was Brett. He stood completely still, facing away from me, his posture unnaturally rigid. Even from 20 feet away, I could see something was terribly wrong. His arms were extended in front of him, holding something that vibrated so violently it blurred in the moonlight. The stone. It shook with such force I could see the tremors traveling up Brett's arms, making his whole body quiver slightly. But what made me freeze in my tracks was the dark liquid trailing down the sides of Brett's neck, black in the moonlight, but unmistakable. Blood. It streamed from both his ears, soaking the collar of his jacket. "Brett," I called, my voice sounding thin and insignificant against the overwhelming presence of the music. He didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there, swaying almost imperceptibly to rhythms that now filled my head with perfect clarity. The music was beautiful in a way that made my skin crawl, complex patterns that seemed to contain knowledge, ancient and terrible. It filled me with a sense of wonder and bone-deep dread simultaneously, like looking at something humans were never meant to comprehend. I approached slowly, calling his name again, louder this time. "Brett, can you hear me?" Still no response. The blood continued to flow from his ears, a steady trickle that told me whatever was happening was getting worse by the second. When I finally reached him and moved around to see his face, I had to stifle a gasp. Brett's eyes had rolled completely back in his head, showing only the whites. His mouth hung slightly open, his expression one of rapture despite the blood now dripping onto his shoulders. The stone in his hands vibrated with impossible speed, its surface shifting between deep gray and absolute black faster than my eyes could track. It wasn't just vibrating anymore. It was pulsing, as if alive. I recognized immediately what was happening. The music, whatever it was physically damaging Brett's hearing. The human ear wasn't designed to process these sounds, these impossible harmonies, and Brett had been listening to them for days, each night growing longer, each session more intense. Without thinking, acting purely on instinct, I reached out and grabbed the stone from Brett's hands. His fingers offered no resistance, opening easily as I pulled the stone away. The moment it left his grasp, Brett's body went completely limp and I had to lunge forward to catch him before he collapsed face first onto the snowy ground. The stone felt unnaturally heavy in my palm, and for one terrible moment, the music crescendoed to an almost unbearable volume, as if in protest at being taken from its chosen listener. I felt the vibrations travel up my arm, into my chest, rattling my teeth and making my vision blur. The music stopped so suddenly that my ears rang with the absence. One moment, impossible harmonies filled my skull. The next, a vacuum of silence so complete it felt like I'd gone deaf. I stood frozen in the clearing, the stone now lifeless in my palm, Brett's body slumped against me. "Brett?" I called, my voice sounding strange and distant in the aftermath of that otherworldly symphony. He didn't respond. His head lolled backward, face slack and pale in the moonlight. Blood still trickled from both ears, black in the dim light. I lowered him carefully to the ground and pressed 2 fingers against his neck, holding my breath until I felt the steady rhythm of his pulse. His chest rose and fell with shallow but regular breaths. The stone sat inert in my hand. I turned it over, studying its perfect spherical shape. Just moments ago, it had vibrated with impossible energy, but now it felt like nothing more than ordinary rock, cold, smooth, and lifeless. I slipped it into my jacket pocket and returned my attention to Brett. "Brett, can you hear me?" I patted his cheek gently, then more firmly. Nothing. I checked his pupils with my flashlight. They contracted normally, which was somewhat reassuring, but he remained completely unresponsive, his body limp and heavy. The blood from his ears had stopped flowing but left dark trails down his neck and into his collar. Getting him back to camp would be challenging. Brett wasn't a small man, and the forest floor was now dusted with snow, making the footing treacherous. I had no choice but to carry him. I positioned myself beside him, worked my arms under his shoulders and knees, and lifted with my legs. His weight settled against my chest as I straightened, adjusting my stance to balance the load. The stone in my pocket pressed uncomfortably against my thigh, but I ignored it and started walking, following our tracks back through the trees. The journey back to camp took 3 times longer than the trip out. I had to stop every few minutes to readjust my grip and catch my breath. The snow made the ground slippery, and twice I nearly lost my footing. Brett remained unconscious throughout, his head resting against my shoulder, his breathing thankfully steady. When I finally broke through the tree line and saw the tents, relief flooded through me. The camp looked undisturbed. 4 dark tents, with Brett's flap still hanging open just as I'd left it. The other clients slept on, unaware of the crisis unfolding. I carried Brett directly to his tent and maneuvered him carefully inside, laying him on his sleeping bag. I removed his boots and outer layers, then zipped him into the bag to keep him warm. The blood on his neck and ears had dried, but I used water from my canteen and a clean bandana to gently wipe away what I could. I set up a makeshift monitoring station, positioning my sleeping pad and bag just outside Brett's tent where I could check on him regularly throughout the night. I grabbed my medical kit and satellite communicator, placing them within easy reach. Then I settled in for a long vigil, checking Brett's vital signs every 20 minutes. His pulse remained steady. His breathing never faltered, but he didn't wake up, didn't stir, didn't show any signs of returning to consciousness. The stone sat on the ground beside me, looking ordinary and harmless in the beam of my headlamp. The night stretched endlessly. I fought to stay awake, pinching my thighs and splashing cold water on my face whenever my eyelids grew heavy. The temperature continued to drop, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, watching the cloudy puffs of my breath in the beam of my headlamp. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten, I'd made a decision. We needed to get Brett to a hospital immediately, which meant ending the trip for everyone. I knew there would be pushback. These men had paid thousands for this exclusive guided experience, but Brett's condition left no room for debate. I waited until I saw movement from the other tents before making my announcement. Joel emerged first, zipping his jacket against the morning chill. "What happened?" he asked, noticing my position outside Brett's tent. "And why is it so damn cold?" "We had a temperature drop overnight," I said, "and Brett's sick. I need to talk to everyone." One by one, the others emerged from their tents. Harold checking his satellite phone as always, Bodie meticulously rolling his sleeping pad, Easton grumbling about the cold. "Listen up," I said once they had gathered. "Brett's unconscious. He wandered out of camp last night and I found him collapsed in the woods. We're cutting the trip short and evacuating immediately." The reactions came quickly and predictably. "Unconscious?" Bodie asked, his face creased with concern. "From what?" "What about the rest of the trip?" Easton demanded. "I cleared my schedule for this." "Is he breathing?" Joel asked, peering toward Brett's tent. "Yes, he's stable," I said, addressing Joel's question first. "But he needs medical attention. I'm calling for helicopter extraction as soon as we have enough light." Harold stepped forward, his expression calculating. "I paid $20,000 for this experience, Logan. Surely we can split up. You take Brett out, and we continue with the planned route." I shook my head firmly. "That's not an option. I can't leave you out here without a guide, and Brett needs immediate medical attention. This isn't up for debate." "What's wrong with him exactly?" Bodie asked. I hesitated, unwilling to mention the stone or the music. "I'm not sure. Possibly altitude sickness or some kind of seizure. He's completely unresponsive, but his vitals are stable." "Can we at least see him?" Joel asked. "Briefly," I said, "but then I need you all to pack up. The sooner we're ready, the faster we can get him help." I unzipped Brett's tent flap and allowed them to look inside. Brett lay still in his sleeping bag, face pale, dried blood still visible around his ears despite my attempts to clean it. "Jesus," Easton muttered. "What happened to his ears?" "I don't know," I said truthfully. "That's why we need to get him to a hospital." The sight of Brett's condition silenced further complaints. The men dispersed to their tents and began packing with uncharacteristic efficiency. I retrieved the satellite communicator from beside my sleeping pad, careful to keep the stone out of sight, and stepped away from camp to make the call. The emergency response team asked detailed questions about Brett's condition, location, and the terrain around us. I provided our exact coordinates and described a small clearing about a quarter-mile from our position that could serve as a landing zone. They confirmed a helicopter would be dispatched, but warned it might take 6 hours to reach us given our remote location. I returned to camp to find the clients had packed most of their gear. I checked on Brett again, still unconscious but breathing steadily, then helped the others break down their tents and distribute the weight of our supplies. No one complained about carrying extra gear once they understood the situation's gravity. "What about Brett's stuff?" Joel asked, gesturing to the tent where Brett still lay. "I'll handle his gear," I said. "I need you guys to help clear the landing zone I described to the rescue team." I gave them detailed instructions on removing any loose debris or branches that might pose a hazard to the helicopter, then turned my attention back to Brett. I carefully packed his belongings, leaving out only what he would need for the evacuation. The stone I wrapped in a spare shirt and buried deep in my own pack, away from curious eyes. When I checked Brett again, I noticed his eyelids fluttering slightly. I leaned closer, hoping for signs of consciousness, but his eyes remained closed and he didn't respond to my voice or touch. The blood around his ears had completely dried, but I worried about internal damage I couldn't see. The others returned from clearing the landing zone, and we settled in to wait for the helicopter. The morning stretched into afternoon with agonizing slowness. I checked Brett's vitals regularly, offered the clients food and water, and tried to keep everyone calm. No one asked about the stone, and I volunteered nothing. "How long until the chopper gets here?" Easton asked for the third time, checking his expensive watch. "They said 6 hours. That puts them here around 2 o'clock, I replied, trying to keep the edge from my voice. "These things take time." "And they're definitely coming?" Harold pressed, "because I can make some calls if we need to expedite things." "They're coming," I assured him. "The best thing we can do is be ready when they arrive." I returned to Brett's side, checking his pulse again, still steady. His breathing remained unchanged, but he showed no signs of waking, and that worried me more with each passing hour. Whatever that stone had done to him went beyond physical injury. It had reached into his mind somehow, using that impossible music as a conduit. The stone sat in my pack, seemingly dormant, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was merely waiting, gathering strength for whatever came next. I touched my pocket where I'd first placed it, half expecting to feel warmth or vibration, but there was nothing. Just the memory of that otherworldly music and the image of Brett standing in the moonlight with blood running from his ears. In the distance, I finally heard the distinctive thump of helicopter blades cutting through the mountain air. I stood and motioned to the others. "That's our ride," I said. "Let's get Brett ready to move." The helicopter appeared over the ridge, a small black shape against the blue sky, growing larger as it approached our position. I grabbed my pack, feeling the weight of the stone inside it, and prepared to evacuate my clients from a wilderness that suddenly felt much more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. I stood by Brett's tent, watching his unconscious form while keeping one eye on the ridge where the helicopter would appear. The stone sat heavily in my pack, wrapped in a shirt and buried under spare clothes. I had checked it twice in the last hour. Still cold, still lifeless, nothing like the vibrating, humming object that had put Brett in this condition. "How much longer?" Easton called from where he paced near the cleared landing zone. "They said 6 hours. It's been barely 4, I answered, my voice rougher than I intended. Lack of sleep had worn my patience thin. Joel approached, his expensive hiking boots crunching on the thin layer of snow. "Any change?" he asked, nodding toward Brett's tent. "No. Pulse is steady, breathing normal, still unconscious." "And the blood from his ears?" Harold joined us, his satellite phone clutched in one hand. "That's not normal for altitude sickness." I never said it was altitude sickness for certain. I kept my answer deliberately vague. "Could be an aneurysm, inner ear infection that ruptured. We won't know until the doctors see him." "You were with him last night, weren't you?" Bodie asked, standing slightly apart from the others. I thought I heard voices. The other 3 clients turned to me, waiting for an explanation. I felt the weight of the stone in my pack, a physical reminder of what I couldn't tell them. "I found him sleepwalking," I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. "When I tried to guide him back to camp, he collapsed. That's when I noticed the bleeding." "Sleepwalking?" Easton scoffed. "Brett's never sleepwalked a day in his life. We've been on golf trips together for years. People don't usually sleepwalk in their bedrooms with all the comforts of home," I countered. "Wilderness, altitude, exhaustion, they can trigger unusual behaviors." Harold stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Logan, we're paying clients. If there's something you're not telling us about what happened to Brett." "There's nothing else to tell," I cut him off, turning away to check on Brett again. "I found him. I brought him back. And now we're waiting for medical evacuation. That's the situation." The lie sat uncomfortably in my chest. 20 years of guiding, and I'd never lied to clients about safety issues before. But how could I explain what I'd seen? The vibrating stone, the impossible music, Brett standing in a trance while his ears bled. They'd think I was crazy, or worse, that I'd somehow caused Brett's injuries. For the next 2 hours, I maintained my vigil, checking Brett's vitals, sipping water to stay alert, and fielding more questions from the increasingly restless clients. Each time I entered Brett's tent, I half expected to find the stone had somehow returned to his hand. but he remained still, his face pale against the dark fabric of the sleeping bag. "There!" Joel shouted suddenly, pointing toward the ridge. "I see it!" A black dot appeared against the pale sky, growing larger as it approached. The distinctive thump, thump, thump of helicopter blades cut through the mountain silence. "Get your gear," I ordered, already moving toward Brett's tent. "Stack everything by the landing zone. I'll handle Brett." The clients scrambled to gather their belongings while I carefully wrapped Brett in his sleeping bag. His eyelids fluttered slightly as I lifted him, the first response I'd seen since he collapsed. "Brett, can you hear me?" I asked, but his eyes remained closed. The helicopter's roar grew louder, whipping the pine branches into a frenzy as it descended toward our cleared landing zone. I carried Brett across the campsite, the weight of his limp body straining my arms. The clients stood back, watching with wide eyes as the medical team jumped from the helicopter and ran toward us with a stretcher. "Male, mid-40s, unconscious since approximately 2 a.m., I shouted over the noise, laying Brett on the stretcher. Bleeding from both ears, no visible head trauma, breathing and pulse stable. The paramedic nodded, already checking Brett's pupils with a pen light. "You coming with us?" he asked. I glanced at the 4 remaining clients. As their guide, I was responsible for them too. "We can find our way back," Joel said, reading my hesitation. "It's only a day's hike to the trailhead from here." "No," I said firmly. "The company will send another guide to escort you out. Standard protocol for evacuations." I turned back to the paramedic. "Yes, I'm coming. He's my responsibility." The clients looked relieved as I climbed into the helicopter beside Brett's stretcher. I clutched my pack tightly, feeling the outline of the wrapped stone inside. As we lifted off, I watched the campsite shrink below us, 4 figures standing among the scattered tents, growing smaller until they disappeared beneath the tree canopy. Inside the helicopter, the medics worked efficiently, attaching monitors to Brett and starting an IV line. I pressed myself against the wall, staying out of their way while keeping my eyes on Brett's face. About 20 minutes into the flight, his eyelids fluttered again, then opened fully. "He's waking up," I called to the nearest medic, who immediately leaned over Brett. Brett's eyes darted around wildly, confusion evident in his expression. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Suddenly he raised his hands to his ears, pressing his palms against them with obvious distress. "Brett," I said, moving closer. "You're okay. We're taking you to a hospital." He didn't respond, just kept touching his ears, his face contorting with panic. When I put my hand on his arm, he finally looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "Can you hear me?" I asked slowly, emphasizing the words with my lips. Brett shook his head violently, then winced at the movement. He pointed to his ears again, his fingers trembling. "He can't hear," I told the medic. "The bleeding from his ears. Could he have lost his hearing?" "Possible tympanic membrane rupture," the medic replied, shining a light into Brett's ear. "We'll know more at the hospital." For the remainder of the flight, Brett drifted between consciousness and sleep, each time waking with the same panicked realization that he couldn't hear. I kept my hand on his arm, offering what little comfort I could while the stone sat in my pack, a cold, silent reminder of what had really happened. The helicopter landed on the hospital roof 2 hours later. Brett was whisked away on the stretcher while I followed, still clutching my pack. In the emergency department, I was directed to a waiting area, while Brett was taken for evaluation. A hospital administrator approached with clipboard in hand. "You're the guide?" she asked. I nodded, suddenly aware of how I must look, unshowered, sleep-deprived, still in my wilderness gear. "We need some information about what happened," she said, pen poised over her form. "The patient appears to have significant hearing loss, and the doctors are trying to determine the cause." I hesitated, weighing my words carefully. "We were on a guided wilderness trek. I found him unconscious early this morning with blood coming from his ears. He had been acting strangely the day before, distracted, not eating much. Any loud noises in the area? Gunshots, explosions, equipment failure? No, I said, the lie coming easier now. Nothing like that. It was a standard wilderness trek. No unusual incidents until I found him unconscious. She made notes on her clipboard. And had he complained of ear pain, dizziness, or hearing problems before this incident? No, nothing. Insurance information? I provided what I knew about Brett's coverage, answering questions mechanically while my mind kept returning to the stone in my pack. After she left, I sat in the waiting room for 3 hours, declining offers of coffee from the staff. I needed to be alert, to think clearly about what had happened and what I should do next. Finally, a doctor in scrubs approached me. "Mr. Perkins, I'm Dr. Reyes. I've been treating Mr. Anderson." I stood up, suddenly aware of the weight of my pack. "How is he?" "Physically stable, but I'm afraid I have concerning news." Dr. Reyes gestured for me to sit back down and took the chair opposite me. "Mr. Anderson has suffered severe bilateral sensorineural hearing loss. In simple terms, the sound-detecting hair cells in his inner ears have been damaged. Will it improve, with time or treatment?" Dr. Reyes shook his head. "The damage appears to be permanent. We've run several tests, and the pattern of injury is quite unusual. Typically, this kind of damage results from exposure to extremely loud noises, explosions, industrial accidents, that sort of thing. But you said there were no loud noises in the wilderness?" "None," I confirmed, feeling sick. The music had done this. Music that only Brett could hear, or at least hear fully. I'd heard it too, but more distantly, more protected somehow. "That's what makes this case so puzzling," Dr. Reyes continued. "The damage pattern suggests exposure to specific frequencies at extremely high volumes, but in a very controlled way. It's almost surgical in its precision. I've never seen anything like it." I swallowed hard. "What happens now?" "We're keeping him for observation and further testing. He'll need to be fitted for hearing aids, though they won't restore normal hearing. And I've recommended psychological counseling. He's exhibiting signs of acute trauma beyond just the physical injury." "What kind of signs?" I asked, though I could guess. "Extreme agitation, apparent hallucinations. He keeps making gestures like he's holding something and listening to it. When we try to communicate with him through writing, he becomes frustrated and writes questions about the music and the stone. Does that mean anything to you?" I shook my head, the lie burning in my throat. "No, nothing." Dr. Reyes looked at me for a long moment, as if sensing my dishonesty. "Well, the insurance investigators will want to speak with you, and there may be legal questions, given the circumstances." "Legal questions?" "Standard procedure when a client is injured during a guided expedition. I'm sure you understand." I nodded, though my stomach tightened. "Of course. I'll cooperate fully." "You can see him if you'd like, though I should warn you. He's quite distressed. We've given him mild sedatives to help him calm down." "I'd like to see him," I said, standing up with my pack. Dr. Reyes led me through the emergency department to a curtained area where Brett lay on a hospital bed. His wilderness clothes had been replaced with a hospital gown, and his face looked gaunt in the harsh fluorescent lighting. When he saw me, his eyes widened and he tried to sit up. "Easy," I said, forgetting he couldn't hear me. Brett grabbed a notepad from the bedside table and scribbled frantically. He thrust it toward me. "Where is it?" I pretended not to understand. "I don't know what you mean." He wrote again, his pen tearing the paper. "The stone. Give it back." "Brett, you need to rest," I said, deliberately speaking aloud while knowing he couldn't hear me. I took the notepad and wrote, "You had an accident. You need to recover." He snatched the notepad back. "I need the stone." It was talking to me. "Give it back." I wrote, "There is no stone. You were hallucinating." Brett's face contorted with rage. He threw the notepad across the room and tried to grab my pack. I stepped back, keeping it out of his reach. A nurse hurried into the room, alerted by the commotion. "He needs to rest," she said firmly, giving me a pointed look. I nodded, backing toward the curtain. "I understand. I'll come back later." Brett's eyes followed me, filled with a desperate, knowing look that chilled me more than any wilderness storm ever had. He knew I had the stone, and he wanted it back. In the hospital corridor, I leaned against the wall, my heart pounding. The stone sat in my pack, seemingly harmless now, but I knew better. It had destroyed Brett's hearing and possibly his mind. And yet I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. Something about it demanded to be studied, understood, but safely, away from vulnerable minds like Brett's. 2 hours later, after giving statements to hospital administrators and insurance investigators, carefully edited versions of the truth, I sat in the hospital cafeteria, picking at a sandwich while considering my next steps. Brett's hearing loss was permanent. He would need ongoing therapy, both physical and psychological, and I had provided statements that deliberately omitted crucial information about what had really happened. The weight of these facts settled on me like a physical burden, almost as heavy as the stone in my pack. 20 years of guiding in the wilderness, and I had never encountered anything like this. Something that defied explanation, that harmed without leaving evidence anyone would believe. I made my decision. I would keep the stone secure, away from others. I would research what I could about the area where Brett had found it, and I would carry the truth alone. Because who would believe me if I shared it? As I left the hospital that evening, I glanced back at the building where Brett lay, forever changed by what he had heard. Music that wasn't meant for human ears. Messages from something ancient that had used him and discarded him when he could no longer serve as its listener. I adjusted my pack, feeling the weight of the stone inside, and walked toward the parking lot where a company vehicle waited to take me back to headquarters. The stone remained silent, dormant, but I knew now what it was capable of, and that knowledge would haunt me long after this day ended. I returned home after the incident and kept the stone, storing it in a locked box in my basement. The metal container had been a gift from an old client years ago, a small fireproof safe meant for documents or valuables. It seemed appropriate somehow, though I doubted fire would affect whatever the stone actually was. I placed the stone inside, still wrapped in the shirt I'd used in my pack, and shut the heavy door with a solid click. For the first week, I checked it daily. Each time I'd unlock the box, unwrap the cloth carefully, and examine the stone. It remained completely inert, showing no signs of the vibrations or supernatural properties it had displayed in the forest. Just a smooth, perfectly round rock that shifted between deep gray and black depending on how the light hit it. I'd hold it briefly, waiting for that tingling sensation to return, but my palms remained normal. No music came. No vibrations. Nothing. By the second week, I started checking it less frequently. The stone stayed silent, cold, and lifeless, like it had never done anything unusual at all. The company gave me 2 weeks of paid leave after the incident, standard procedure after a client emergency. I spent most of it at home, avoiding calls from the other 4 clients who'd been on the trip. Their messages piled up, questions about Brett, about what really happened, about whether they could book me again for next year. I let them all go to voicemail. When I returned to work, my supervisor handed me a stack of incident reports to complete. I wrote down the facts as I'd reported them. Brett had been acting strangely. I found him unconscious with bleeding ears. I called for evacuation. Nothing about the stone, nothing about the music, nothing about how I'd lied to everyone involved. The company's insurance team accepted my explanation without question. They'd seen stranger medical emergencies in the backcountry. During quiet evenings at home, I researched the area's history but found no references to similar phenomena or mysterious stones in local records. I checked geological surveys, archaeological studies, even local folklore collections. The region was known for its natural beauty, some interesting fossil deposits, and occasional reports of unusual weather patterns. Nothing supernatural. Nothing about stones that sang impossible music or drove men to the edge of sanity. I expanded my search, looking into Native American legends from tribes that had inhabited the area. The Shoshone and Crow had stories about sacred places in those mountains, but nothing specific to where we'd been camping. Nothing about singing stones or music that could damage human ears. The company assigned me to routes in different parts of the state. I didn't object. In fact, I requested it specifically, claiming I wanted a change of scenery. My supervisor seemed relieved, probably worried I'd be hesitant to guide at all after what happened. Truth was, I had no problem guiding. I just couldn't go back there, not to that specific region. Months passed. Fall turned to winter, winter to spring. I led groups through snow-covered valleys and along icy ridges. I taught winter survival skills to corporate teams and guided photographers to the best spots for wildlife shots. I did my job well, as I always had, but something had changed. I found myself listening more carefully to the sounds of the wilderness, the wind through pine needles, the calls of birds, the rushing of streams, all normal sounds following patterns I'd known for 20 years. Nothing like what I'd heard that night. Nothing like what had destroyed Brett's hearing. Months later, I still felt haunted by the experience. Having guided hundreds of successful trips through Wyoming's wilderness, I knew I would never return to that particular region. I'd made peace with that decision. There were plenty of other beautiful places to take clients, places without singing stones. The memory of the otherworldly music and Brett's traumatic condition continued disturbing my sleep. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain I could hear faint traces of those impossible harmonies. I'd lie awake, listening until I convinced myself it was just the house settling or the neighbor's air conditioning unit. Just normal sounds. Nothing supernatural. One morning in early summer, I found a certified letter in my mailbox. I opened it at my kitchen table, coffee growing cold beside me. I received a letter from Brett's lawyers requesting all documentation from the trip. They wanted copies of my guide logs, route maps, weather reports, equipment checklists, medical incident reports, client waivers, and any photographs or recordings I might have taken. The letter didn't mention a lawsuit explicitly, but the implication was clear. Brett was building a case. Maybe against the company, maybe against me personally. The letter mentioned serious and permanent injuries sustained while under your professional care, and full disclosure of all relevant factors contributing to the incident. I sent only the official paperwork, keeping the supernatural elements to myself. I made copies of everything in the company's files, the same sanitized version of events I'd documented months ago. I included the route maps, the weather reports, the equipment checklists, all factual, all verifiable. Nothing about the stone, nothing about the music. I considered writing Brett directly, asking how he was doing, explaining what I knew, what I'd seen. But what would I say? That an ancient stone had sung to him and destroyed his hearing? That something beyond human understanding had chosen him as its listener? He'd either think I was mocking him or trying to cover my negligence with an absurd story. Or worse, he'd believe me. He'd know I had the stone. He'd want it back. So I mailed the documents to his lawyers and said nothing else. Let them build their case on altitude sickness or some undiagnosed medical condition. Let them blame my negligence or the company's policies. Let them find some explanation that made sense in a courtroom. I had survived an encounter with something beyond human understanding, and I carried the weight of that knowledge alone, knowing others would never believe my account of those terrifying 6 days in the remote Wyoming mountains.